Here we go. How's your name pronounced correctly? Adieu. Thank you. All right. And finally, Dominic Williams of Spring Labs. All right. So I hand it over to Tim Swanson. And again, welcome all.
Hey guys, great to be here. I think Elaine and Matt had complimented you for inviting me. So my presentation is actually a little bit different than what the panel is going to be on. I was asked to talk about a couple of the posts I've written in the last couple of weeks. Fortunately, I get to sit next to Sean when he gets to yell at me. It's great seeing all these faces. Many smart people here, much smarter than myself. So please, if you have any questions, try to hold those towards the end. Just a quick disclaimer, I am here as a representative of me, not representing R3. I'm not going to talk about R3 at all. So again, just quick disclaimers, I'm not a lawyer and I don't own any cryptocurrencies. So I have no position whatsoever on what happens with these groups. So why does code is not law matter? I know there's a whole meme that code is law. I'm going to argue that it's not in the next 14 minutes. Basically, when you're validating transactions or code on a network, who is liable and who has legal standing when something forks or breaks, has a hack or a mistake, there's a block reorg or orphan, there's who has recourse and restitution in case something like this happens. Bottom line is, when the system doesn't behave like it's supposed to, who is liable for that? So if the cryptocurrency community could actually achieve this algorithmically, you probably would have done so. I know that's probably going to end a lot of tomatoes in my car. And that's why we're having this meeting today, because that obviously didn't happen with a couple of different systems today. So, we know anarchic chains, or what people call public chains, intentionally lack a terms of service, end-user license agreement, service level agreement, any kind of customer service. Most customer service for the chain itself is handled by Twitter and Reddit. You see this on upvotes, retweets. It's probably the worst way to actually handle any of this stuff. But it's intentional, because if there was a way to actually hook that stuff in, you can also create a way for it to be shut down. So it's intentionally designed that way. And in addition, all these systems, at least that exist today, for these public chains, they have no way of hooking into external legal systems or identification systems. So you have ways to try to hook those external systems into something like Bitcoin from one name or something like that. That's a whole other topic. So what does this look like in practice? I'll give you a few examples. By the way, this whole deck will be online. This is not private or anything like that. You can take pictures of it. So obviously, everyone here is familiar with the DAO attack, counterattack, counterattack, and I guess it'll be, the joke is every 28 days there'll be some guy, or 26 days for like the next 30 years trying to siphon that way to other child apps. But this solution was carried out through an off-chain mechanism through lots of debates, and there was no on-chain way of doing this. And we see this happen a lot with mining activity too. This is just 4 examples I have. Every month or so, or every 2 months, you see somebody on Reddit saying, oops, I sent too big of a fee. Now some of these fees are just like $5 or $10. Some of these are really large though. Here's a $23,000 one, $19,000 one, $1,000. And just a couple months ago, somebody sent $137,000 to a mining tool. And there's been a lot of discussion on Reddit what why this was, and a lot of people complaining back and forth to actually get their fees back. This last one was actually interesting because half that fee ended up at the Bitcoin Foundation. So that's a whole other story. And again, if you're interested in the DAO attack, here's an interesting timeline. I don't have time to go through it. KWM is a law firm that put this together. We could talk about it maybe during the panel or something. A couple more incidences for those keeping track of keeping score at home. You had, obviously 6 years ago, you had some kind of fork. Depending on who you talk to, it was either a soft fork or hard fork. Basically 184 billion Bitcoins were created, and then you eventually had to solve that within a day. You had the 2013 incident in which you had about 24 blocks over the course of 6 hours that were effectively forked off. The 2 big losers there were BTC Guild and OKPay. OKPay was like a $10,000 bill spend. Anyways, that coordination to fix that was done by IRC. Again, another off-chain mechanism. The next hack, and I'm actually going to go into that a little bit here. If you haven't seen the latest bit, they announced that they are working with off-chain governance again with law enforcement, including the FBI. They're doing a haircut across the entire exchange at 36%. Through socialized losses. So if you want to see the actual hack go on, there's actually 2 or 3 CEOs I see in right now that work for or created AML companies. I won't single them out here because I know they're looking for business, I'm sure, in this community. Basically, I asked one of them, I said, what are the first 10 blocks that included transactions from the hack? Since nobody's actually gone through and identified those transactions publicly yet. These are the first 10. BTC China, the BTC pool, pool was the first to include a transaction that was stolen. And then you see all the way down some of the other pools you may recognize. This chart here just shows transactions from P2SH moving, and you basically had 10% of all P2SH coins effectively move in about 2 days. Here's Lux here actually posted this yesterday. You can actually see the 120K move over a course of 20 blocks. This was actually about a 3-hour time span if you look at the timestamps. So my point with all of that is, so 9 out of the 10 of these block makers, these pools, are actually, the first blocks were effectively mined and operated in a country that doesn't have the same rule of law we have here. And that can be concerning as you go back to the very beginning of the slides. There's all those questions. You have to change those answers because data privacy and property laws work are different. And again, before you say I'm biased toward China, my wife is Chinese, I lived in China for 5 years, I love China. I would have the same criticism with the pools we here in the US. So the question is can mining pool operators be held liable for some damages? Since they leaked their identity, just a couple days ago, they had a group of miners here in the US. If you could identify miners and convince them to fly over to the US, then the question is in the future, if there's even a bigger attack, can you actually hold them accountable for processing those transactions, even though they do it over a course of 3 hours? What kind of risk monitoring will the market regulators place onto the market now? Again, if you're having to go this route, that defeats the purpose of it, having an anarchic chain. I know there's a couple CEOs in this space already in this room. I can see that 2/3 of your team are basically compliance now. You have to do all these different MSB, MTL, KYC, AML regs. There's 10 companies now that just solely handle that for startups in banks. So how does this do with Ethereum? Well, you guys had a hard fork. I'm not going to describe that. But we know who actually mined the first 2 blocks. It's BW.com, BW Pool. It's Bitbank, I believe it's actual full name. They're a pool in China that actually does heavy stuff in Bitcoin as well, Bitcoin mining. The question goes back to this. Everyone's always, the maximalists on both sides are always saying, oh, FIs are going to use these networks. Okay, well, maybe they do, maybe they don't. But if they do, what happens if those financial instruments end up on an orphan chain or orphan block or discarded chain? How does that happen? Who's responsible for that? Where's the restitution going to come into? These are questions that nobody's really actually answering. What happens after the fork? I'm not going to go into this. This is just chart showing the ETC basically picking up to ETH. It's about 20-25% on a given day this last week. But the common theme here is the fact that anarchic chains, we continue to see governance and dispute resolution continues to take place off-chain, which kind of is self-defeating because you have to go through courts. If the whole purpose is to be self-contained and sovereign, leaking it to the outside world opens you up to all sorts of extra stuff. And again, you basically end up with a system that's caveat emptor, which is like the buyer beware. And this is very frictional. I don't know I know that people like to say buzzwords 2 years ago because of frictionless systems. This is very much a frictionful system if you have to depend on outside courts at this point. So, but what if you can link code to legal pros? So, there's some alternatives, and I'm not here to pitch you here to say this is what you need to do, but I will say that there are ways to actually resolve this. Going into this whole distributed ledger ecosystem, there are companies and projects out there trying to create a way to link smart contract code with legal infrastructure and courts. And some examples would be party contracts. Barclays has published a paper last week. They've had a whole initiative called the Smart Contract Template. Eris is a team out in Europe. They have something called dual integration. Florida, that's a project we're working on in R3. There's also some other projects that you guys may want to check out too. Common Accord out in France. Tezos, that's a local company in Mountain View. And I'm going to go through these real quick. Ian Grigg, about 15 years ago, created something called party contracts. The bottom line, what he was trying to do is make it easily readable, basically contract that anyone can read, and also be readable by programs. It's digitally signed, packaged together, and give it a unique identifier. And this is the way he models it. Again, this will be online, so I don't have time, unfortunately, to go through bit by bit on why this is important. But basically, you can see the dry code to wet code. I see Nick here, so to borrow your phrase. Josh Stark is an attorney out in Toronto, and he came up with some legal terminology that Barclays also used in the paper. It's very different than what the code is logged and people push. And basically, he separates the terms into 2 different terms. Smart legal contracts, which are the agreement is an actual legal agreement, and it's capable of automatic execution in software. And we also have smart contract code, which may not necessarily be linked to some kind of legal infrastructure, but can be automatically executed. So, by the way, I want to ask, how many lawyers are in this room? Wow, 2. developers. You guys should go to law school. So I think it's easier for lawyers to learn code than vice versa, but that's just one. And as I said, you can throw tomatoes. This is not supposed to be a fun presentation. So Richard Brown, he's the CTO of the company I work at. 3, and the system he's been building till 4. The bottom line is this middle point here. How do you link legal prose with the contract code? And again, the assumption here is there's gonna be something somewhere in which there's dispute. So how do you handle that up front? And so you spend a lot of time. It's easy to code. I'm sure all you developers just want to security code and hack and stuff. That's great. I'm not saying you can't, but you definitely should. If you plan to work with regulated financial institutions, there needs to be a way for you to link into the system that they work in, which is basically courts. So why should you care about how other platforms are handling legal prose and contracts? Basically, the bottom line is, if you don't say up front what's going to happen if there's a dispute, you're going to end up in court, which is entirely self-defeating for an enacted change. If you have to go to court, then you've defeated the purpose of the sole proof of work mechanism and all that. So to solve this problem up front, you should just say how it's going to be resolved. And I'll give you an example. But after that, I want to mention exactly why this is relevant to the theorem. So there's a theorem in ETC, and I'm sure we'll have many forks down the road based on how the community loves to fork stuff now. I don't own any. So basically, you have no de jure authority. Nobody here, maybe Charlie King, he actually created like it. But aside from him, nobody here can actually say this is the way this change should look like. There's no way to definitively say there's a one true change, because all we have is a de facto world to live in. Now, there's ways to attest to which one is the most correct or should be correct, and that's where you have these different mechanisms and different types of stakeholders. You have obviously different foundations, and we're not going to go into the politics of that. But basically, despite your claims on social media that code is like, can't be because it actually doesn't tie into any legal system. Now, you can say, yes, that I want to ignore that legal system, but the legal system is not going to disappear. And what ends up happening is you end up having this hand-wavy process we see in both communities, in which you see both in the Ethereum community with Classic, basically through the upvoting process and retweets, or in the Bitcoin Core versus Classic, that's even more, it's been going on for 18 months, and effectively, they have private conferences now for miners, which is just self-defeating. You don't see that in section 12, the non-existent section 12 of the white paper. If all else fails, we're going to hold conferences in Palo Alto with miners. So yeah, you have an enormous amount of off-chain governance that takes place. Well, maybe Sean does, I don't know. Is that in their version of the white paper? Any potential solutions for the Ethereum community? So I asked Ian about this about 4 or 5 days ago, because Ian also works for us, and I said, hey, if you were going to talk to people that are Ethereum developers, how would you resolve this situation? So this is his checklist of ways to try and, going forward, if you're going to create a chain or going forward in the community. Bottom line is try to actually have prose that contains the terms and conditions, and you embed it all into a contract, and then you ship it basically within the law. But the problem is going forward, obviously, is you have a lot of people disagreeing. How do you vote? Like, there's no on-chain governance still, a way of voting. Obviously, Tezos, I think, is one of the few that tries to do that. And Ian actually says that you can accommodate pseudonyms with this. So that was the fastest presentation I gave. This is the conclusions. My contention is basically, if you're doing anything above board in commerce that you think is going to end up in court, and it needs to use a chain, it's really self-defeating to try and tie in the quote-unquote permission aspects on top of a quote-unquote permissionless chain. And so I would pitch to say, hey, just use a permission ledger if you're going to do that. But otherwise, I think there's a lot of cool stuff with these anarchic chains, but there are, again, until you figure out the governance stuff, it's always going to boil down to social media arguments and who has the most followers and stuff like that. So I don't have the most followers. That's it. So any questions? I think I have maybe 1 or 2 minutes. Yes.
The first thing that came to mind when you talked about full liability for processing the stolen coin was on carrier status, or for marginalized. The question is if the code isn't the law because the social contract is the law.
I actually would not get behind. I made that joke. The social contract's not worth the paper it's written on. So, like, this whole community is always talking about, let's get this stuff ironclad in code, but they don't actually define stuff. They do with this nebulous like governance structure to you end up censoring an entire forum on Reddit just to push one specific agenda. And then obviously the other group does the same thing. So what is a social contract? It's very nebulous. Like obviously we live here with constitutions and stuff like that, but that's a whole other conversation. I don't endorse social contracts. Any other questions? Was that?
The question.
Well, the question is, what do I think Ethereum should have done? So, this is my own personal view. I think that by forking Ethereum to simply get away from this DAO attacker sets a slippery slope precedence. Like, what happens if another 10% of the coins are hijacked or stolen or something like that? Like, what stage? What's the actual litmus test to determine who does it? Again, it's happened, and it looks like there might be another fork at some point because of replay attacks and stuff like that. So I don't know if any of those are justified because, again, there's no de jure framework around that. That's a good question, Sean.
So, where does Ian Grigg think the disputes will be resolved in this imagined blockchain? Because the blockchain is international, but it's sort of tied into law. But the question is, it's 196 countries. Which country's judicial system will resolve the dispute?
So I don't want to put words into Ian's mouth, but if you didn't hear the question is blockchains are global, so which jurisdiction do you choose? And I believe his argument, I don't want to put words in his mouth, obviously you'll tweet at him if you want, would be, hey, basically you're going to say within the terms and conditions where the arbitrator will be. So how do you convince everybody that's using the system? Like if I went ahead and made the contract today with you, and we're going to choose Hong Kong as it, well, not everybody else is saying I want to go to Hong Kong or do something with the system. So I think it's really difficult now that the cat's out of the bag. Maybe if you're starting from the beginning, if you have Pebble and stuff like that, maybe before you launch Pebble, you can do something like that.
So what do you think about the idea that it's not like code is law or it's not law as a binary thing, but it's kind of more of a spectrum where like how far could the law in code take you, and then arbitration and real world stuff is kind of like a fallback mechanism for whatever's not defined? Because I think we are seeing more and more voting mechanisms or whatever starting to come out, either using like days destroyed or signaling readiness with like, by the miners with these bits, and then the smaller chain will be attacked. And like Peter Todd had an interesting proposal about that. So there's always going to be something unexpected that could happen, and it might have to go to arbitration. But like, what do you think about more and more stuff happening in coded law?
Sure, great question, right? So basically these ideas of being Bitcoin stays destroyed or a certain amount of hash rate, it's very ad hoc, and like we're just coming up with arbitrary metrics to determine it. Now, if the community says, hey, that's what we'll do, that's what we'll do. Going forward, I think it's so difficult that you have two systems that are already out there to try and convince either community that, oh, this is the way it should be done. You're not going to have any, like, you're going to have a group of people who will just feel alienated and marginalized no matter what. Like for us, trying to look at all the different potential problems is something we really care about. We obviously want to automate as much as you can, but as you said, what happens if you can't? What if you have a break? And that's what we spend a lot of time trying to game theorize around.
I guess my question was, your sort of prescription was use a permission blockchain. And I'm sort of curious as to, within a permission blockchain, how you tie those contracts to some sort of legal resolution mechanism.
So, good question. Again, I don't want to hijack this meeting because I know that the panel's not going to be talking about that specifically. But basically, and I think I'm getting signal from someone. Go ahead. One time? Less than
I'll answer the question for sure.
Okay, answer this question. So, bottom line, I'm not pitching that you need to use a permission ledger. It's useful for certain areas. If you assume that you're going to have to deal with legal infrastructure and court systems, you have to deal with real-world identities, you already know the identities of people. You don't need proof of work to do that, so there's no point in that whole system. But if you're trying to continue using something like Bitcoin or Ethereum or some anarchic system, then you have to figure out a solution for it. At least in my view, you need to come up with a solution that is robust against out-of-band attacks. Because look, let's just say, game theorize this, if these guys flew from China, these miners, and it's so easy to attack them, kidnap them for $250,000 and say you have to attack the network now. I mean, there's obviously all sorts of different ways of doing it, and I'm sure my tires will be sliced for saying that that's what you should do. I'm not saying you should attack anyone in China. So, it's a good question. We can talk about this. And I think that's it. Thanks for your time.